I supported my wife through her addiction recovery, only for her to later say she needed to find herself while getting involved with her therapist. In response, I ruined their lives, and now they're pleading with me. My name is Kevin. I am 38, and I work as a structural engineer in Austin. I manage mid-sized commercial renovation projects, which means steady hours, decent pay, and a schedule built around deadlines rather than chaos. I am not flashy, but I am consistent. I bought a 2-bedroom house in South Austin 6 years ago, and I have lived there ever since. My wife is Lena. She is 35. We have been married for 7 years, and together for 10. We do not have children. Until recently, we share the mortgage, the utilities, and a fairly predictable routine. 3 years into our marriage, Lena developed a dependency on prescription pain medication after a minor surgery. What started as something legitimate shifted slowly into something that controlled her mood and schedule. I was the one who noticed first. I was also the one who insisted we address it. I paid for private treatment when insurance started limiting coverage. I rearranged my project assignments so I could drive her to outpatient therapy 3 times a week across town. I sat for family sessions where she described me as rigid and emotionally unavailable, which I accepted because I understood she needed somewhere to put her anger. Recovery was not clean or quick. There were relapses. There were missing pills. There were nights where she was sharp and cruel for no reason other than withdrawal. I did not threaten to leave. I did not scream. I documented finances, locked up medications in the house, and set clear conditions. If she skipped therapy, I would inform her parents. If she lied about prescriptions, I would move out temporarily. I followed through once, for 2 weeks, and she corrected course. That is how we operated. Direct action, clear consequences. By last year, she was stable. She had been sober for 14 months. She credited her therapist heavily, a man in his early 40s named Merrick who specialized in addiction recovery. I never met him outside of one joint session. He presented as calm and measured. I had no reason to doubt his professionalism. The shift did not start dramatically. It began with Lena telling me she felt confined, not by sobriety, but by me. She said she had spent so many years defined by addiction that she no longer knew who she was. At first, I assumed this was a normal phase after recovery. What I did not expect was how quickly that narrative would start to include someone else. At first it was subtle language changes. Lena stopped saying we when she talked about the future. It became I need and I want. She started staying longer at her weekly sessions. What had been an hour became 90 minutes, sometimes 2. When I asked, she said recovery is not a stopwatch. She accused me of treating therapy like a billable project. I accepted that explanation for a while because it sounded reasonable. I work in an environment where time is measured, tracked, optimized. I assumed I was projecting that mindset onto something that should be fluid. Still, I pay attention to patterns for a living. Structural integrity depends on noticing small shifts before they become failures. She became sharper at home, not chaotic like during withdrawal, but deliberately dismissive. If I asked her session went, she would say Merrick understands things you never did. If I suggested we take a weekend trip like we used to, she would say she was focusing on growth, not distractions. The first time his name entered an argument directly was on a Thursday night. I had asked her to confirm whether she would attend my firm's annual dinner. It is not glamorous, but spouses are invited. She rolled her eyes and said Merrick thinks I am too dependent on your professional image. He says I have spent years orbiting your stability instead of building my own. That phrasing stuck with me. Orbiting your stability. It sounded rehearsed, clinical. I asked her if she felt that way or if that was something he suggested. She snapped that I was jealous of the only person who ever helped her without conditions. That comment was inaccurate. My support always came with conditions because addiction without boundaries becomes chaos. She knew that, but she reframed it as control. Over the next month, that narrative hardened. I was the rigid engineer. He was the empathetic guide. I was structure. He was freedom. Then she told me she needed space. Not a separation, just emotional distance to find herself. She said that phrase calmly, like she had practiced it. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She could not define it clearly, which is when my concern shifted from insecurity to suspicion. I do not accuse her of anything. I started gathering information instead. When I say I gathered information, I do not mean I hacked her accounts or installed anything on her phone. I mean I paid attention to observable facts. Lena had always left her phone face up on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, it was always screen down. She started taking calls on the back patio instead of in the living room. When I walked out once to ask about dinner, she covered the speaker with her hand and said she would be inside in a minute. It was not a friend. I could hear the low tone of a man's voice. I checked our shared credit card statements. Nothing dramatic. No hotel charges. No large unexplained purchases. But I did notice that her therapy payments had shifted from weekly to twice weekly. She had not told me that. When I asked, she said recovery is non-linear and accused me of auditing her healing. I asked directly if she was seeing Merrick outside of scheduled sessions. She laughed in a way that was not amused. She said that is exactly the kind of paranoid control that proves I am not emotionally safe. That phrase again sounded rehearsed. Emotionally safe. I requested one concrete boundary. If she needed space to find herself, fine. But therapy should remain therapy. No contact outside scheduled appointments. No private messaging unrelated to treatment. That is standard ethical practice. I was calm when I said it. She stared at me and said you do not get to dictate how I heal. She also said something that changed the temperature of the room. She said you would not understand the connection we have because you only operate in transactions. Connection, not guidance, not support. Connection. That was the moment I stopped assuming this was just post-recovery identity confusion. I asked her a very simple question. Are you romantically involved with your therapist? She did not answer immediately. She asked why I always jump to worst-case scenarios. I repeated the question. She said I do not know what I feel yet. For me, there was an answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I asked one more direct question. Are you in personal contact with him outside scheduled sessions? She said we talk when I need clarity. That phrasing told me everything. The house is in my name. I bought it before we got married. The mortgage, deed, and insurance are solely mine. She contributes to utilities and shared expenses, but legally it is my property. I have always been deliberate about paperwork, not because I expected this, but because that is how I operate. I told her clearly that she would not continue living in my house while cultivating a personal connection with a therapist. There was no option presented. I was not asking her to choose between us in that moment. I was ending cohabitation effective immediately. She tried to minimize it. She said nothing physical had happened. She said I was overreacting to an emotional support dynamic. I told her that a licensed addiction therapist engaging in personal communication with a married client is not a support dynamic. It is a breach, and I will not share a bed with someone who is emotionally investing elsewhere while framing it as self-discovery. She called me cold. She said this proved she was right about me. I stayed practical. I told her to pack essential clothing, toiletries, and any personal documents she needed. I transferred half of our joint savings into her individual account while she stood there, so she could not claim financial coercion later. I documented the transfer on my laptop. She asked where she was supposed to go. I told her that was no longer my responsibility. If Merrick was providing clarity and connection, she could lean on that. She said that was unfair. I said what is unfair is expecting me to fund a situation that disrespects me. I gave her 40 minutes. I remained in the living room while she moved through the bedroom, pulling clothes into a suitcase. There was no screaming, just tension. When she finished, I carried the suitcase to the front door and set it on the porch. I told her that once she stepped out, I would be changing the locks the following morning, not out of spite, but because ambiguity creates mess. She stood there waiting for me to reconsider. I did not. She did not cry. That is something people usually ask when I tell this story. No tears, no dramatic pleas. She shifted tactics instead. She said I was abandoning her during a vulnerable phase. She said after everything she survived with addiction, I was proving that my support had always been conditional. I agreed that it was conditional. I told her that sobriety required structure, and so did marriage. I am not interested in open-ended emotional triangles disguised as therapy. She stood in the doorway holding her phone like it was a lifeline. I asked one last practical question. Are you planning to continue seeing him as her therapist while communicating personally? She said she needed him, not his program. Him. I opened the front door. I did not touch her. I did not drag anything. I simply stepped aside and told her it was time to leave. She tried one more angle. She said if I forced her out, she would tell people I was emotionally abusive. I told her she was free to say whatever she wanted. The deed and the bank transfers would speak for themselves. That is when she finally walked out. I closed the door and locked it. I did not feel rage. I felt clarity. The next morning I called a locksmith and had the exterior locks replaced. I also updated the garage code. I kept the receipt. Again, documentation. By midday she was texting nonstop. First it was anger, then it was disbelief, then it was bargaining. She said we could create new boundaries together. She said Merrick had encouraged healthy separation, not eviction. That detail caught my attention. Encouraged separation. That meant he knew. I responded once. If he is advising you on our marriage outside clinical parameters, I will be contacting the licensing board. Her reply came within seconds. You would not dare. She still did not understand that I operate on process, not emotion. I did dare. Before doing anything formal, I verified my assumptions. I drafted a short email to Merrick from my personal account. I kept it factual. I stated that my wife had informed me they were communicating outside scheduled sessions, and that he had advised her regarding separation from our shared home. I asked him to clarify whether their contact extended beyond professional boundaries and whether he was still acting as her licensed therapist. I did not threaten in that message. I requested documentation. He replied the next morning. The tone was controlled but defensive. He said he could not discuss a client without written consent. That is standard and fair. What was not standard was the second paragraph. He wrote that therapeutic relationships can evolve and that growth sometimes disrupts existing partnerships. Therapeutic relationships can evolve. That is not neutral language. I forwarded that email to Lena and asked if she had provided written consent for him to discuss her treatment philosophy with me. She did not respond directly. Instead, she sent a long message about how I was attacking the only person who truly supported her autonomy. Autonomy had become her new keyword. At that point, I shifted from personal to procedural. I pulled the state licensing guidelines for mental health professionals in Texas. They are public. Dual relationships with current clients are explicitly prohibited. Romantic involvement is grounds for investigation, even if initiated by the client. I did not need proof of physical involvement. I needed evidence of boundary erosion. I compiled a timeline, dates of extended sessions, screenshots of her messages referencing his personal advice, the email where he framed disruption of marriage as therapeutic evolution. I saved everything in a dated folder. Then I filed a formal complaint. Not out of spite, out of principle. If a therapist inserts himself into a vulnerable client's marriage and begins framing himself as the path to self-discovery, that is not romance. That is exploitation. Within 48 hours, both of them understood I was serious. And that is when the pleading started. Lena called first. Not text, not a long message. An actual call. I let it ring once before answering because I wanted to be certain I was calm. Her tone was different. No edge. No superiority. She said filing a complaint could destroy his career. I said if his career depends on private emotional entanglement with married clients, then it deserves scrutiny. She said I was twisting something innocent into something unethical. I asked her directly if they had discussed a future together. Silence. Then she said that was not the point. For me, that was confirmation. 2 hours later, Merrick emailed again. This time the language was cautious. He stated that any perception of impropriety was a misunderstanding and that he valued professional ethics. He asked if we could resolve this privately to avoid unnecessary escalation. Unnecessary. I responded that the board would determine necessity, not me. I also informed him that I had preserved all written communication. That ended his tone of quiet authority. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Lena's certainty collapsed. She showed up at the house 3 days later while I was home. I had already changed the locks. She rang the bell repeatedly until I opened the door, but remained inside. She looked smaller. Not physically, just uncertain. She said he had reduced her sessions abruptly. She said he told her continued contact could jeopardize his license while an investigation was pending. So the man who encouraged her autonomy now needed distance. She asked if I would withdraw the complaint. She said this had gone too far. I told her it went too far when her therapist began positioning himself as a replacement partner under the language of healing. She said she never meant for it to explode like this. I told her actions have consequences whether intended or not. For the first time, she said she might have misread the connection. That was the beginning of the unraveling. After that visit, the tone shifted completely. The arrogance was gone. What replaced it was fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of exposure. Lena began sending long messages trying to reframe everything. She said Merrick never explicitly crossed a physical line. She said therapy creates emotional intensity, and I was misinterpreting professional language. She said I was retaliating because I could not tolerate her independence. I did not debate. I requested one practical thing. full access to all communication with him outside scheduled sessions. If this was truly innocent, transparency would protect everyone. She delayed. She said I was interrogating her. She said trust cannot survive surveillance. That was ironic considering the situation. I repeated the request once. She refused again. There was enough, Qley. I sent a final message. I will not continue this discussion. The complaint stands. Do not come to the house again without prior notice. Then I blocked her number. Not out of anger. Out of containment. Continuous back and forth only creates emotional leverage points. I removed that option. I also blocked her on social media and adjusted privacy settings. If she needed to coordinate retrieval of remaining belongings, she could do so through email or through an attorney. Structured channels only. 2 days later, Merrick emailed again. This time the language had shifted from confident to urgent. He wrote that misunderstandings can spiral and that professional reputations take decades to build. He suggested mediation. He implied that Lena's recovery could be destabilized by unnecessary stress. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded his email to the investigator assigned to the complaint and added it to the documentation file. Attempts to influence the complainant during review are not a good look. By the end of the week, both of them understood that access to me was closed. No emotional negotiations. No reactive conversations. Just process. For the first time since this started, I felt fully in control of the situation. Blocking Lena did not stop the consequences from unfolding. It just removed the emotional noise. About 3 weeks after filing the complaint, I received formal confirmation that an investigation had been opened. They requested copies of all communications I had referenced. I provided them in an organized folder with dates and short summaries. No commentary, just facts. A few days later, Lena showed up again. This time she did not ring the bell repeatedly. She knocked once and waited. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She looked exhausted. Not dramatic, just worn down. She told me Merrick had terminated her as a client effective immediately. He cited conflict of interest concerns and the pending review. She said he recommended she transfer to another provider in a different practice. So the man who positioned himself as uniquely attuned to her growth had stepped back the moment scrutiny appeared. She said he stopped answering personal messages. She said he told her any further contact could be misinterpreted. That word again, misinterpreted. Then she asked the question I expected eventually. If I withdraw the complaint, will you let me come home? I answered carefully. The complaint is not leverage. It is a response to behavior. Even if I withdrew it, the underlying issue remains. You chose to emotionally invest in your therapist and frame me as an obstacle to your evolution. She said she was confused. She said recovery changes people. I agreed. It does. But confusion does not require secrecy or triangulation. She tried one final angle. She said she still loved me, and that this was a mistake amplified by pride. That may even be true, but intent does not erase impact. I told her I would proceed with filing for divorce. Not out of revenge. Out of finality. For the first time since I met her, she had nothing sharp to say back. I filed for divorce the following Monday. Texas has a waiting period, which I was already aware of, so there was no dramatic courthouse sprint. I retained the same attorney who advised me during the complaint process. Clean paperwork. Clear asset separation. The house remains mine. The joint savings had already been divided. There were no children to complicate custody. From a legal standpoint, it was straightforward. Emotionally, it was not chaotic either. That is what surprises people. There was no screaming match at the end. No last-minute reconciliation attempt. Once I made the decision, I did not revisit it. About a month into the investigation, I received notice that the board had issued an interim restriction on Merrick's practice pending full review. I was not given details beyond procedural language, but it was enough to confirm that the complaint was taken seriously. Lena emailed me once after being served divorce papers. A long message about regret and how quickly everything unraveled. She said she never expected him to distance himself the way he did. She said she felt discarded by both of us. I responded with one paragraph. I did not discard you. I enforced a boundary when you chose to redirect your emotional loyalty. That is not abandonment. That is consequence. I did not block her email. I simply stopped engaging beyond logistical matters related to the divorce. No late-night reflections. No postmortems. People sometimes ask if I ruined their lives. I did not fabricate anything. I did not exaggerate. I documented, reported, and removed myself from a situation that disrespected me. If a licensed therapist decides to blur lines with a married client and frame himself as her path to self-discovery, that is his decision. If my wife chooses to participate in that dynamic while living under my roof, that is hers. My decision was simpler. I refused to subsidize it. Now the house is quiet again. The schedule is predictable. The locks are mine, and I do not regret acting when I did.